Welcome back to another episode of Smooth Brain EDH, where we make the smoothest plays with the biggest brains. We're back after a busy holiday season and are super excited to bring you all new gameplay here in 2022. First up today is Ethan on Rionya, Fire Dancer. This mono-red deck plans to cast a lot of cheap red spells and rituals in one turn to allow its commander to make tons of copies of high-impact creatures and smash opponents' life totals down. He keeps a hand of Mountain, Sandstone Needle, Shatterskull Smashing, Seething Song, Valakut Awakening, Solemn Simulacrum, and Coercive Recruiter. Next up is Logan on Tivash, Gloom Summoner. This is a mono-black life gain deck, hoping to gain life every turn to pump out huge demons with Tivash's ability on his instep. He starts the game with a Swamp, a Snow-Covered Swamp, Urborg Tomb of Yawgmoth, Bajuka Bog, Pristine Talisman, Worn Power Stone, and Murderous Rider. Our third player today is Chandler on Xyris, the Writhing Storm. This deck has a focus on drawing cards, finding ways to draw extra cards, and punishing opponents for drawing theirs. He keeps a hand with Command Tower, Stomping Ground, Scalding Tarn, Seagate's Restoration, 3 Visits, Heroic Intervention, and a Thought Vessel. Last up today is Shelby on Gisela, Blade of Gold Knight. This is a Boros aggro / Angel tribal deck that uses its commander's extremely powerful ability to close out the game. Shelby starts the game with a hand of Mountain, Temple of Triumph, Clifftop Retreat, Mana Crypt, Loyal Warhound, Search for Glory, and Smothering Tithe. We're about to hop right into it, but before that, go ahead and leave us a comment on who you hope will come out on top this game. While you're down there, go ahead and give us a like, check out our description for the deck lists, and subscribe so you don't miss any of our upcoming content. Speaking of new content, we're starting a podcast and should have our first episode out later this week, so stay tuned. Now, on to the gameplay.
It looks like Shelby wins the die roll, and he plays tapped Temple of Triumph and scries one to the top. He then passes to Ethan, who plays his Sandstone Needle, and then passes to Logan. Logan plays a Swamp and passes to Chandler. Chandler plays Scalding Tarn, and then passes the turn back to Shelby. Shelby plays a Mountainous Land for a turn, then free casts his Mana Crypt, and then taps for 4 and casts Smothering Tithe on turn 2. He then passes turn, and Ethan does not pay. Ethan will then play a Mountainous Land for turn, tap for 3 to cast Seething Song, and then will use 4 of that mana to cast a Solemn Simulacrum, finding a tapped mountain to the battlefield. The turn is then Logan's, who cannot pay for Smothering Tithe. He'll then play a Worm as land for turn, and then just pass to Chandler, who fetches on his end step for a Ketria Triome. Now in his turn, Chandler cannot pay for Smothering Tithe, and then plays a Command Tower. He then taps for 2 to cast 3 Visits. He'll find a tapped Breeding Pool to the battlefield, and then passes the turn to Shelby. On his upkeep, Shelby unfortunately rolls off camera, but does not have to take damage. After this, he plays a Clifftop Retreat as land for turn, and then pays 7 mana for a turn 3 Gisela. The turn is then passed to Ethan, who does not pay for Smothering Tithe, and plays another Mountainous Land for turn. He'll then tap for 5, sacrificing his Sandstone Needle, and then cast his commander, Rionya. He'll then move to combat, and make 1 copy of Solemn Simulacrum. He'll find a mountain to the battlefield tapped, and then swing that copy at Shelby, who blocks it with Gisela. Ethan will draw a card, and Shelby will get another treasure. The turn is then passed to Logan, who doesn't pay for Smothering Tithe. He'll then play an Urborg Tomb of Yawgmoth, tap for 3, and cast a Worn Power Stone, then pass the turn to Chandler. Chandler doesn't pay for Smothering Tithe, but will play an Alchemist Refuge as land for turn. He'll then tap for 2 and cast a Thought Vessel, then tap for 3 and cast Cultivate. He puts an island to the battlefield and a forest to his hand. The turn is then shipped to Shelby, who rolls for Mana Crypt and does not have to take damage. He then casts a Loyal Warhound, finding a Plains to the battlefield tapped. He'll then tap for 3 and cast Search for Glory, and find an Avacyn to his hand. After this, he'll tap for 3 and cast a Commander Sphere, and then move to combat, swinging for 10 in the air at Ethan. After this, he'll pass to Ethan, who does not pay for Smothering Tithe, but he will cast an Arcane Signet, and then a Warlord's Fury, drawing a card and not paying for Smothering Tithe. He then plays a Mountainous Land for turn. He then casts a Tormenting Voice, discarding Shatterskull Smashing, and drawing 2 cards, not paying for Smothering Tithe. He then casts Renegade Tactics, making Shelby's Warhound unable to block, and then draws a card, also not paying for Smothering Tithe. He then moves to combat and makes 4 copies of Solemn Simulacrum, and tutors 4 mountains to the battlefield tapped. He then swings for 4 at Shelby, and then passes the turn. Logan doesn't pay for Smothering Tithe, then taps for 3 and casts Pristine Talisman. He'll then play Bajuka Bog, exiling Ethan's graveyard, then passes the turn to Chandler. Chandler doesn't pay the tithe tax, then shocks in a Stomping Ground. He then taps for 7 and casts a Seagate Restoration, drawing 5 cards and permanently not having a max hand size. Ethan protests about giving Shelby 5 more treasures, even though he gave him 4 his previous turn. And Chandler argues that he only has Ramp, lands, and 1 useless non-land card in his hand. And so after the spell resolves, Shelby will get 5 more treasures, and Chandler will pass the turn. On his turn, Shelby rolls for Crypt and takes 2 damage. He then plays an Evolving Wilds as land for turn, then sacrifices 8 of his treasures to cast Avacyn, Angel of Hope. Seeing this as his only chance to do something about Shelby's board, Logan decides to respond by sending his Murderous Rider on an adventure to bring Gisela to a swift end. Thanks to Pristine Talisman, Logan will only lose a total of 1 life to swift end. Gisela will be destroyed, and Shelby decides to just put her in the graveyard, which worries the table. And for a good reason, because Shelby floats 9 mana and casts Raya Dawnbringer, hoping to get Gisela back on his next upkeep and potentially kill someone. And after that pretty impactful turn, Shelby will pass to Ethan. And Ethan will start off with a basic mountain, then tap for 4 to cast a Stormkiln Artist. Oh, and I forgot to mention, he doesn't pay for Smothering Tithe. Shelby decides to respond to the artist by sacrificing his Commander Sphere to draw a card. Moving on, Ethan Crimson Wisps his artist to draw a card and give it haste. He'll make a treasure off this, and not pay for Smothering Tithe. He then casts a Ruby Medallion, then a Valakut Awakening, making a treasure, bottoming 1 card, and drawing 2, not paying for Smothering Tithe. He then drops a Dockside Extortionist. With the ETB trigger on the stack, Shelby thinks for a while, and ultimately decides to sacrifice his 4 treasures in response, floating 2 red and 2 white. Dockside's ability resolves, and Ethan makes 5 treasures. Now, with only 2 cards left in hand, Ethan decides to go for the 50-50 gamble, and his artist replaces the treasure he used to cast it. He searches for a card to hand, and then rolls for it. Unfortunately, he does discard the card he wanted, which was a Wheel of Fortune. He still casts his leftover card, which is the Coercive Recruiter from his starting hand. Unfortunately, he doesn't get to continue his spell-slinging shenanigans, but he does realize he has lethal on Shelby. He starts by gaining control of his Avacyn and giving it haste. He'll then move to combat and make 4 copies of his Recruiter, gaining control of the rest of Shelby's board. Tokens have haste, and so do the creatures he gains control of. Ethan then moves to declare attackers and makes all of Shelby's creatures attack him. He then swings all 5 of his Coercive Recruiters, even though one of them should have Summoning Sickness. It's an honest mistake, sorry about that you guys. This is a total of 35 damage, which is just enough to kill Shelby. Even if we had caught that mistake in the game, Ethan would still have swung enough to kill Shelby. He then swings a 9 power Stormkiln Artist at Logan, and then 6 damage at Chandler, and they both just take it. Upon killing Shelby, Ethan loses his creatures, he'll then move to his end step, and all his copies will be exiled. And now empty-handed, Ethan passes the turn to Logan. Now in his turn, Logan will play a Cabal Coffers, and then activate it for 5 mana. He'll then use that 5 mana to cast his commander, Tivash. After this, he'll tap for 3 and cast the Murderous Rider, who is in exile. He'll gain a life to his Pristine Talisman. He then moves to his end step, pays 1 life, and makes a 1/1 Flying Demon. He then passes the turn to Chandler, who starts off with a basic forest. He'll then tap for 6 mana, and cast a Consecrated Sphinx. He just passes the turn to Ethan after that. And when Ethan draws his card for turn, Chandler will draw 2. Ethan then plays the mountain he drew, and then moves to combat. He then very politely asks Chandler to block a copy of Solemn Simulacrum, and Chandler agrees since he'll be able to draw 2 cards off of it. Ethan then makes a copy of Sad Sam, gets a mountain to the battlefield tapped, and then swings said copy at Chandler, who blocks. Ethan will draw a card, and Chandler will draw 2. Ethan then asks Chandler if he wants to do it again, and Chandler says gladly. So Ethan taps for 6 and hard casts the Fury of the Horde, gaining an extra combat step. He also gets another treasure off this. He then moves to his next combat step, makes 2 copies of Solemn Simulacrum, finding 2 more mountains to the battlefield tapped, and then swings 1 at Logan and 1 at Chandler. Chandler gladly blocks with his Consecrated Sphinx again, and Logan will block with Tivash, gaining 4 life. Ethan will then draw 2 cards, and Chandler will draw 4. Ethan then casts a Double Vision, which costs 1 less thanks to Ruby Medallion, and then a Primal Amulet. The turn is then passed to Logan, and when he draws a card, Chandler will draw 2. Logan will then play a basic swamp as land for turn, then activate his Cabal Coffers to float 6 black mana. He then uses 4 of it to cast a Crypt Ghast, and Chandler decides this is his best target for his mana drain, so he counters it. Logan asks why Ethan gets a Double Visions and a Primal Amulet while he can't have a Crypt Ghast, but Chandler assures him he's not just targeting him and will deal with Ethan's board. So Logan continues, and he casts a Disciple of Bolas. When it enters the battlefield, he sacrifices his 1/1 demon to gain a life and draw a card. When he draws a card, Chandler draws 2. He also gains 1 to his Pristine Talisman. After this, Logan will move to his end step, pay 2 life, and get a 2/2 Flying Demon. The turn is then passed to Chandler, but Chandler stays on his end step and casts Force of Vigor, pitching a Triumph of the Hordes. He chooses Double Visions as the first target and lets Logan choose Primal Amulet as the second. Unfortunately, Ethan has no responses to this, so both targets are destroyed. The turn is now Chandler's, and he gets 4 colorless mana at the beginning of his pre-combat main phase. He'll then cast an Avenger of Zendikar by using that 4 colorless mana and tapping for 3 more. He'll get 7 plants and then play Castle Embrith to trigger landfall, getting counters on all of them. And finally, he casts a Rhystic Study before passing the turn to Ethan. And when Ethan draws a card, Chandler will draw 2. After that, hoping to refill his hand, Ethan drops a Wheel of Misfortune and pays for Rhystic Study. Chandler immediately responds with a counter spell. Ethan is very understandably disappointed, but Rionya, with this board and a new full grip, could potentially win the game on the spot. After this, Ethan will move to combat and make 2 copies of Solemn Simulacrum, finding 2 tapped mountains to the battlefield, thinning his deck as much as possible. Ethan then swings them at Logan and tries to coax him into blocking them, but Logan decides to just take the 4 damage. Ethan will then pass the turn, but on his end step, Logan will activate War Rune, losing a life and drawing a card, and Chandler draws 2 off of his Sphinx. And Chandler will draw 2 more on Logan's draw step. After this, Logan plays another swamp as land for turn, and then will activate Cabal Coffers for 7 black mana. He'll then use 5 of it to cast an Allhammer Archive, and Chandler forgets about Rhystic Study. Using the rest of the mana and then tapping for the rest, he casts a Grey Merchant of Asphodel. This will drain everyone for 6, and he'll gain 24, and he also gains 2 from his Pristine Talisman. Chandler remembers Rhystic Study this time, and Logan doesn't pay. After this, he'll tap for 4 mana and cast Vraska's Contempt on Chandler's Avenger of Zendikar, ensuring that those plant tokens can't get out of control. And Logan will gain 4 life from this, and Chandler accidentally puts his Avenger into the graveyard, not realizing Vraska's Contempt exiles. Luckily, that doesn't matter at all this game. Logan will then move to his end step and pay 30 life to make a 30/30 Flying Demon. That's a big boy. And then Chandler asks if Logan paid the extra 1 for Vraska's Contempt, and Logan said he could not have. Now on Chandler's turn, he starts off with a Dockside Extortionist. And Ethan responds by sacrificing all 4 of his treasures. And so, Chandler gets 6 treasures with Dockside's ETB. And after thinking for a bit, Chandler decides to go big or go home and taps completely out and sacrifices all of his treasures to cast a Finale of Devastation, X is equal to 11. Ethan, who only has a mountain in hand, is 100% out of this game, so he offers congratulatory handshakes. Logan points out that with his 30/30, he could still potentially live. But Chandler finds Craterhoof Behemoth with the Finale, and that'll give all of his creatures a total of +21/+21 when combining Craterhoof's +10 and Finale's +11, not to mention they get Trample and Haste. And so, Logan will also concede, and today's winner is Chandler. Well everyone, there you have it. Was your pick the winner? Let us know in the comments below. We always love hearing from you guys. And sorry about the long break, it was a really busy holiday season for us. But don't worry, we're going to go right back into the weekly content. And as you already heard in the intro, we're starting a podcast, so be sure to keep an eye out for that too. Don't forget to hit the bell icon so you know when we upload, and if you want to check out the decks, they'll be in the description below, along with links to our social media pages. As always, you guys, thank you so much for watching, and have a smooth day.